All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming today, especially after such a big week last week in terms of the amount of information we put out there. We're going to keep today relatively brief because of that, and really wanted to focus on some things that are following on from last week as we look forward to the coming quarters. And so we put the agenda in the chat, but the main thing we wanted to talk about was the extension of KIP 21 that's on the forum. So this is the proposal that would extend the leadership team's ability to act as they have been doing successfully for the past couple of quarters. And so Hazard has kindly agreed to join us to talk with us about it and really to answer any questions that anybody wanted to bring to the forum. So Hazard, thank you for coming. There was one question that somebody had earlier where they were asking what would happen if this measure did not pass. So maybe we could start there.
So if the measure didn't pass, so I think the question was about if it really didn't pass, right? Right. So obviously if it didn't pass voting, we'd go to reconciliation. But if there was no ability to come to reconciliation and everything was not able to move forward, then the best way to describe what would happen is nothing, right? Mm-hmm. I would be whatever powers or whatever are enumerated in the KIP 12 or 21 would not be available to myself or Joey or to anybody else. That would effectively mean that there would be no ability to hire or budget or represent things or our roles as, those particular titles and stuff. Mm-hmm. Work would continue. People would continue to work. The Sabler streams that have been set up would continue to run. But when those ran out, we don't pack them for 3 years worth of assets or anything. They're done on a fairly conservative time scale. So for here, I think it would be 2 months. There wouldn't be any power to reallocate those funds and pay contributors until that was decided on by some kind of a subsequent governance proposal, et cetera. So this would obviously not be a good thing, probably. Loss of team, et cetera. But that's generally speaking what would happen, right? So, sure. A lot of nothing.
Okay. And I guess that answers well, maybe we could speak to, and I probably should have started here, like what does it enable? What specifically is being delegated here?
Yeah, the idea with KIP 12, essentially this reorganization effort was, at the time there was a recognition of a need to scale, so there was an articulation of a more coherent vision for Keeper DAO. It was Keeper DAO at the time, and a plan that was laid out to achieve that vision, what was needed to do that, or what was felt necessary to do that. And there's a lot of discussion, and what it required was a lot of transformation to happen within what we had then called the core team and this sort of labs team that existed kind of alongside it in some way. And that transformation really came down to a need to rapidly build a more capable organization, right? Bringing more people on board, developing a compensation plan for them, setting a mission, organizing them into like working units with guidance and objectives, and kind of setting them loose. And there was a lot of discussion about the best way to do this, and it was a valid way to do that was suggested and talked about was to do all this through governance individual proposals. So you have a proposal for compensation, you have a proposal to how to onboard and offboard contributors, and how to set objectives, and how to set budgets, and how to charter teams, and so on and so on. At the time, the feeling was, can we just hurry up and do something? We need to hurry up and do something. We need to do something. And so rather than a very granular approach the idea was, let's empower temporarily some of our key contributors to sort of take us through this process of transformation and go from where we are today into a state that looks more like what we want. And as we progress through that transformation, and we learn various things about how it's what's a good way to set this stuff up and how performance works and all of these other factors, we can then go back and take all that knowledge and build that into better structures that can kind of become ossified through governance and ultimately, govern this system. So rather than kind of try to do this top down, let's try to kind of generate this with a little bit of experimentation, and then ultimately take the lessons from that and discover what's best, and then bake that into, permanence through governance.
Okay. Then one last question before I turn it over to others. How will we know? How will we know if this has succeeded? Like, what is our success benchmark for this?
There's no one success benchmark, I would say, because the reasoning for this was mostly to accomplish a transformation of the organization from what it was at the time, which was somewhat small and not particularly coherent or organized, or able to articulate or achieve its objectives, with a tighter, more understandable organization that has clarity around what roles are, what its parts are, how they interact, what kind of legal structure it has, and so on, what kind of accountability structure it has, how is the DAO serviced by and operating with this productive part of it. Products and output and stuff. Is it good? Was this a good idea? Is this a better configuration for the DAO than it was before, and so on? So we didn't define KPIs up front, but what we did define was a need to have quarterly reports that were just comprehensive and just showed everything, to kind of allow people to make an assessment about whether this was good or whether this was bad. This whole arrangement wasn't intended to be permanent. It was intended to kind of get us out of a rut and pop us into a new state, right? A new domain that we could become more competitive in, and then to kind of, once we had settled into that, then to kind of ensure that everything was locked down and that governance and every kind of thing that we needed to use to control accountability more tightly and so on was in place. But for this period, it was sort of a bit free form on purpose, right? With oversight and with transparency quarterly and renewals and so on and so forth. So the goal, how will we know if it's been successful? It's not really, it doesn't really matter whether it's successful or not. That's sort of for people to judge at the end of the quarter whether this should continue or not, I guess, based on what they've seen in the report. As to whether overall this was or wasn't successful, I don't see that as really necessary as much as what it's replaced with. Say it's not successful, it's felt not to be successful, then what it gets ultimately, what becomes ossified may be something different than what we discovered during this period. If it seemed to be successful and people are happy with aspects of it or what it's delivered, then those good pieces of it would become ossified through governance and so on.
I'm going to jump in here. Success was never for the process itself to be successful. It was always meant to be a temporary grant of power in order to keep it out through an expansionary period. So success, in my opinion, here would essentially mean moving towards a more permanent structure.
Right, sure. I'm saying that's obviously that would be so the successful outcome was always to not continue doing this. But whether that's because this thing that we're doing was successful in transformation, or whether it failed and the output of that transformation sucked, is what I'm talking about. So if it was good or if it was bad, something would change. But if it was good, you would expect it to look more like some of the things that we'd learned along the way. And if it was bad, then it would look like, I don't know, something different, maybe what it was before or something totally different that we haven't done before.
Yeah, having been here at the time when this proposal was written and also ratified, I think the major concern by the community, the major driving force behind this proposal was the immediate hiring and expansion of KeeperDAO. And I do believe much of that has already been achieved. As mentioned in the quarterly report and also by various staff members, much of the hiring that is currently needed is already done. So why not already start moving towards a more permanent structure rather than trying to prolong this temporary measure for another half a year?
Is that a question for me?
In general, yeah.
Well, I'll address part of that if you don't mind, Hazard, because I think that it's you're right, Priest. So part of this was, I mean, if you look back at the KIP, it's for hiring people and also for structuring the DAO. And so those are both things on which we've made progress, but especially around structuring, there are still some more things we need to do that will take some time. And so this is also meant to cover that as well.
But what I mean by that is more like already ossifying the parts of the DAO that have already been completed, which in my example, you can leave up governance and structuring as you want, because that is obviously not yet complete. However, ossify what has already been completed, which in my opinion is hiring, budget reviews, and obviously compensations. So we relegate those powers back to the DAO instead of having to continuously relegate them to these temporary measures.
Okay. Well, Hazard, do you want to speak to that, or maybe Tommy?
Sorry, which powers? So I don't think maybe we're not using the same thing. So by ossify, I mean you would have like a. So I'm saying that by ossify,
12.3, subpoint 2, subpoint kind of 1 as well.
So I don't have the KIP in front of me, but is this about hiring?
It's about hiring, distributing, and distributing DAO treasury funds.
I'm not sure that we know whether or not hiring and compensation is something that would be best left to the DAO without any kind of additional structure or anything other than a KIP process, right?
So was the plan always to have these temporary powers in place permanently?
I don't think I would have called them temporary if that had been the plan.
So what exactly, if you don't think it's part of DAO, like if you don't think that it's a DAO
No, I said I don't think we know. I don't think we know. I don't think that what we've learned is that it's a good, or I don't think we've learned that it's a bad thing for those to be. So for example, I'm sorry, did you say something? So for example, if we say that when we onboard a contributor, or we would like to, that we need to make a KIP for that, right? Let's say. That's a question that we don't have any experience as to whether or not that's a good thing or bad thing, or whether that works or whether that doesn't work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. But wasn't that what the last half a year was about? Just like figuring out structures that are the most efficient. But there's not really been a push, from my opinion, to go towards a more DAO relegated model. The push has mostly been still in concentrating the powers. There hasn't really been a testing of alternative models, if that makes sense.
I don't disagree with you, and that's why I'm trying to say that I'm not sure that we, my perspective is that it would be, what we should do is take what we've learned and, use that to guide processes that don't, or perhaps don't, rely on too much delegation. And it's fair to argue that this is maybe too much, right? Or that it wouldn't be the amount that would be desired. But we only have data about how well or not well that delegation has worked. And like you said, it's been quite efficient and so on and so on. But obviously, we have to prepare for...
It's been pretty unanimously centralized. There hasn't really been a striving effort to try and manage this in a more decentralized manner.
I know, but that's because I can only argue out of one side of my mouth. So that was the intention, was to efficiently grow, right? KeeperDAO. And that efficiency was at the cost of some decentralization through the act of delegating these powers, right?
Of course, you did mention that the temporary measure was also in place in order to find the most efficient structures. In order to find the most efficient structures, you would have to have tried different approaches.
I said that it would give us the benefit Yes. So, but what I'm saying is that as of today, I don't think that we've tried those different approaches or developed them to the level that we would like so that we could actually implement them and ossify them through governance. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, but I do believe that it was at least maybe not necessarily conscious choice, but at least like a subconscious choice on your part.
To not pursue those.
Yes.
Well, perhaps instead of a subconscious choice, there was maybe a misunderstanding
Maybe
about
more
priority.
consciously, yes.
Well, there was a first choice to grow, right? And then since we've seen Jason and Guard and some other folks begin to, like Matt and Kyle, begin to develop more about these concepts, I think, I can't quite convince you, but those are consistent with an effort in this direction once the key objectives of scaling and product delivery and shipping products to mainnet, which were accomplished in April. Here, 2 months later, by the end of the quarter, we have a decent cross-section working on these very issues. And to answer the question that you originally asked, why would we extend this? The answer is to do the very thing that you're asking me about why haven't we done, which is to develop these structures and to then ossify them through governance.
Again, let me just be very clear about what I'm asking here. I don't necessarily disagree that it's better to have a more centralized approach regarding structures and obviously legal structure, because that is not something that has been implemented sufficiently to this point. But as mentioned by you, various other team members, and also the quarterly report, hiring has by this point been mostly completed. So why not relegate those powers, which are at this point not really necessary anymore, to the extent that we need to hire like 10 members in next quarter, which would be inefficient, obviously, under a more this decentralized structure. Why not relegate those powers back to the DAO under, for example, something very similar to the Rook Labs budget proposals, where the DAO can allocate a set amount of funds to be granted at your or the leadership's discretion for hiring and such purposes. I don't disagree. I don't agree with this completely unmitigated power over the treasury and hiring in a time when that process has been mostly completed.
But Priest, it is mitigated. Anybody can post a proposal to supersede this one.
And that's what this is about. Like, I don't want to supersede it. I want to amend the current proposal. Or like here,
I think we mean the same thing.
This would not be like a prudent decision. So what speaks against having a budget for hiring?
It's not what speaks against it, because I'm not speaking against it. What I'm saying is that what this sounds like, rather than a question, is perhaps an amendment that you could propose and a system for how hiring could work in an interim period such as this one.
That is what we're here to discuss.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so these moments of tension are actually extraordinary learning opportunities. Until real recently, I wasn't sure what Priest's concerns really were. Now that I feel I do have an understanding of that, my question is along the lines of, is continuing the current KIP as past, if the focus is on creating structures that decentralize power more, something that is good enough for now and safe to try for the community, right? Because it's never about getting perfect, and the value of decentralized and distributed power is just better ability to sense and respond to the actual live environment. So concentration happened to make certain things happen, and seems like most of those certain things have happened. And I understand there to be an effort to decentralize and a desire to do so, but a belief by the people who are currently wielding the power given to them, something that they're trying to do in steps over time to create more likelihood of success, just like they did with the hiring. Did that make sense to you, Priest?
Yeah, I mostly agree. Also, again, I want to make this entirely clear. I'm not against centralizing structures for growth. I do believe that is necessary, especially in an industry as competitive as ours. But I do believe that a subsection of what the original KIP proposed to centralize, such as the budgeting and hiring process, is now at a point of completion where these powers do no longer need to be relegated to a centralized force. I believe at this point it's probably sufficient to delegate those powers towards a DAO and towards something like a budget proposal that just gives an upper ceiling for hiring, compensations possibly as well, and then give the current CEO and CTO and obviously SOFONs the power to choose within that budget proposal however they want.
So, Priest, I think from my perspective, the key aspect of these renewals when they come is providing security for people in the DAO and in labs, that there's some kind of continuity that's going to happen and not some kind of a catastrophic disruption. And we talked a little bit about what that would be, and I don't think that's anybody's intention. It's certainly...
Okay, just quickly jump in. Also, like the characterization at the start of a catastrophic disruption is kind of disingenuous in my opinion, because the DAO obviously didn't work correctly before you and Joey went to CTO and CEO respectively. However, it did function. Like a DAO can still function even without a leadership. And I do believe KeeperDAO would still have the ability to function. Even
I didn't say that it wouldn't function.
Renewed.
I said that it would be a disruption, which is a change from the status quo, right? So
Sure enough,
it would be a large change in the status quo. And avoiding that is helpful for growth, right? Stability is good, especially in a very unstable situation such as this. That's all. However, so what I think is meant when we talk about things like progressive decentralization and so on, or ossification, is a gradual and controlled process which takes place without either holding up or necessarily accelerating other processes that are working until everything is ready. And then there's a cutover, and the cutover essentially doesn't change much because the status quo is basically what's being cut over to. And you've sort of stretched those muscles and tried that out and exercised that already. So today, if we were to begin a discussion about how decentralized hiring or budgeting and so on should work, now is the right time. We have everybody, especially just the people on this call, who've been working and investigating this deeply. However, that discussion could take a great many turns and a good amount of time to come to some form of consensus on, because, for example, it touches on all of the most sensitive issues about the DAO, like compensation and the treasury and budgets and value for dollars and all of these things that we know are very sensitive and can become quite intricate and can involve process such as, for example, if we want to have budgets, well, the lab's budgets today are pretty crude, really. In order to have a proper budget, you likely need to say why you need the money, and you need to be kind of graded on, did that use of funds create the value that was expected? And if not, then the DAO may not be so interested in allowing appropriation for that purpose in the future, let's say, for example. And we don't really have that kind of closed loop process developed right now. We're not even fully certain about the composition of our various teams yet. And you would probably do team-based budgeting if you wanted to be, very modular about it rather than like overall labs budgeting and stuff. I'm not trying to use this to obfuscate. I'm simply saying that this is a deep topic and it's quite interesting and these discussions need to happen. Pardon me. I think the question is, I don't think that maybe this isn't clear, but I think that it's not the intention to bolt these on at the end of a 6-month period, but to gradually dissolve this current structure with these things as we go as a major priority during this coming quarter and then perhaps the one following it. We don't really know how long this process will take, honestly.
Just to quickly interject there, you did talk about gradually decentralizing. From my understanding, you kind of had like a contradicting view there as well, because maybe I'm misunderstanding here, but you want to implement all of the decentralized measures at once, whenever you feel it's ready. Is that correct or not correct? Like you want to immediately phase out KIP 12 and implement everything at once?
Well, not necessarily. I don't see that as
Okay, yeah.
being
Okay, well,
mutually
that doesn't
exclusive.
really make sense to me. So, in my
Okay.
opinion, again, it would be better to gradually phase out singular responsibilities that the DAO believes are already accomplished, which, in my opinion, would be budgeting and hiring. But again, I agree. It's
As I tried to
probably
describe to you just now, I
yeah.
would say that's a misunderstanding that budgeting and hiring, you could argue that hiring is slowed, sure, and that could be budgeted, but I think the budgeting process is quite nascent. It's not only asking for funds, right? You have to have a way to understand whether or not the funds were properly used. For that, you need to have missions and objectives, and for
How
that,
is
you
that
need
different
to
from my
have.
current structure?
I'm sorry, say again.
Just because you have now a budgeting, like I give a specific budget to each separate team, like to the project
What
team,
I'm
to
trying to
whatever.
say is that even this concept of teams is not fully formed at this
I mean,
point in
looking at
time.
the quarterly report, we do have like a rough formation of teams,
That's right.
which we
Things
can
are
budget
settling
to.
into things that look like teams, which is good because they'll likely be called teams. Then they'll need to have a mission. They'll need to have a budget. The budget will need to be justified as being spent on KPIs that the DAO can see and inspect and grade in terms of performance, right? In order to justify continued expense in this area of business and so on. And that process is it's not quite there yet, right?
I just don't believe that's necessary. Like I just think you're making it too complicated for essentially very little gain. Like I think just looking at the quarterly report and with each team stating what they've been working on and like seeing what they've accomplished, I think the DAO can already make a pretty informed decision about whether or not the budget was used accurately and if they want to increase, maintain, or decrease the budget going forward.
But as I
Like
said,
I
that's
don't
a
think you need a
proposal
very
that you
granular approach because that's
proposal
not
that
good
you
for
could
anybody.
make. That's a proposal. That's a fine proposal. And we're here to discuss proposals. So
Yeah. Okay.
That proposal would supersede this extension. So let's say that, this extension went through as currently written, and then literally 2 days later, a tip about team budgets was put up and passed. Wouldn't that accomplish what you're saying?
Definitely. Like, actually, let me clarify that real quick. Like, we could pass this proposal and amend specific, like, portions of it. Like, we could amend. So, even if KIP are we on? KIP 26 passed, we could still amend specific portions afterwards. Or
Right.
do we have to amend the entire structure?
I think that we could amend specific portions of it. That would be my understanding.
Gotcha. Yeah.
After reaching consensus with the DAO, then that would be my understanding.
That's great. Yeah.
I saw you unmute. Did you have another thought there?
I feel like the psychic vibes were going because I was be about to ask a question and then Priest would answer my question before I asked, or Hazard would make the recommendation. What is coming up for me though, because I feel a lot of emotional charge, which suggests high energy of concern, and what I'm not sure has been articulated is what like Priest expresses in a way where he feels, I'm assuming you're a he, I'm sorry, it's just how I'm hearing your voice, that there is some kind of threat to the DAO and that taking more time to establish decentralization would be problematic. The why of that is not clear to me. I don't know if it's clear to other people from history or if it's just not been clearly articulated.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a threat as much as just like it's kind of like in my opinion, it's just suboptimal to give the powers to choose salaries and to choose budgets to the people that directly benefit from it. Like that just to me doesn't seem like a very well-designed system. And even if it's supposed to be only temporary in order to expedite and grow the DAO faster, I think we're currently at a point where that kind of like conflict of I forgot the current word, conflict of interests can be eliminated or should be eliminated.
Okay, so I understand that you see a conflict of interest in that people setting salaries, they got that permission for a specific purpose, which in your mind was that purpose is now taken care of, and so it is dangerous to allow them to continue with clear conflict of interest in terms of what's of benefit for the larger community.
Yeah. Also, I wouldn't necessarily say dangerous. I would just say it's not suboptimal.
Okay, so it's suboptimal.
I don't wanna
So if
insinuate any.
if it's suboptimal, is it possible that the intentions those people have for the next 2 quarters is worth the risk reward of that suboptimality? Because like I said before, it's never a perfect system, right? That's the whole benefit of trying to create more decentralized systems, because with lots of people empowered with lots of different point of views and literally having to be in the discussion about it, we find, at least local optima, but it's never a perfect system.
Oh yeah,
Right.
I fully agree, which is why I'm not pushing to decentralize the entire structure. I'm so I don't believe it's really optimal to decentralize how the DAO decides on its legal structure or its governance structure, because I don't believe they're really there yet. I'm solely focused on the compensation and budgeting structure because I believe they're at a point where it's not really harmful to delegate that.
Oh, my thought about that would be it sounds like in favor of reducing this suboptimality, we would kind of what it sounds like you would prefer to do is have this kind of done before we would extend any other types of tips. Or I'm kind of stumbling over this. What I'm trying to say is you would not be in favor of us finding the more optimal route for hiring and budgeting after an extension, which my fear for that would be there is no extensions, and then there is something that happens, who knows what that something might be, that leaves hiring and budgeting in limbo for such an extended period of time that we are not able to pay people, and people leave, and the project gets torpedoed by that.
I understand that concern, but I believe if it ever came to such an existential threat, I think a proposal could be pushed through with pretty expedient results. It's not like we're gonna be on the last day of the Saber stream and suddenly realize, oh shit, we're not gonna pay people tomorrow. This would be something that's obviously well in public
we are
view.
5 weeks away from that right now.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. So I know that things in terms of governance have varying degrees of speed that happens here. But if there is problems that arise and we can't even agree on a temporary bridge, what's going to happen to all the contributors and folks that now are, expected to either work without being paid or, I guess that would really kind of be my main fear, is that our engineers stop getting paid and they walk away. Shahar, I'm stumbling here. I see you unmute. Go ahead.
I wanted to jump in here. I think I see maybe where a bit of the disconnect is, and I think that you guys are both making good points. Priest, you're right that it's suboptimal, and that that this is the right kind of roadmap to take. And then what we're arguing about is, well, when do we take it? And I think the point is how do we know when we're ready? And the big sticking point for me is, I think your presumption, Priest, is that the DAO, given full control over this process, would do a better job, right? And I don't know that that's true. I don't know that we've proven that. As it is now, right, the DAO has oversight, right? We have oversight into this stuff, and anyone can create a proposal, right, to amend this one or supersede it. But to fully kind of delegate away and delegate to this shapeless entity we call a DAO, I think understandably makes the core team a little bit nervous. And I think the underlying issue there is that we just haven't proved as a DAO that we can, do a really good job at this, and perhaps in the example Dietz gave, where something challenging happens, right, and it's time sensitive, and we have to put something together that passes muster, or face losing, people that have already been onboarded, right? I'm not sure the DAO can succeed in that. We don't know what that's going to look like. I mean, maybe we will. Maybe we'll do a great job, or maybe the few people that are really active are on vacation, and because we don't actually work here, and stuff doesn't happen, and the downside risk to that is really big, right? So I agree, we want to be on a path towards decentralization, and I think what we need to kind of define what that path, the milestones, I guess, on that path so that we can know, and we can collectively have more confidence that, okay, the DAO is actually ready to assume this type of responsibility, because I'm not sure that presumption is correct. That's kind of where I get off. I'm just not sure that the DAO has proven any ability to do, say, a better job than what's currently being done. Maybe we could, but we haven't proved it, and so why would we just ape into that?
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous precedent for me, because I believe centralized, you can run Ethereum on Excel, on an Excel spreadsheet, and it's going to be more performant than the current decentralized version of Ethereum. Decentralization is not necessarily the most optimal or the most efficient solution for most problems. It's there to relegate power to distribute, to avoid negative externalities or negative things that can happen due to centralization. I don't necessarily believe that the DAO would be more efficient in hiring and budgeting than a centralized force, but I do believe that the drawbacks or the negative externalities from adopting such a proposal would be small enough where it still makes sense just from an overall perspective. I think the precedent that we need to have decentralized structures in place that are better than our current centralized structures is a pretty dangerous precedent, because at that point you will never decentralize. There's always never going to be a point where every decentralized counterpart will be more efficient and better than the centralized counterpart. And to me, that just sounds like you're going to be centralizing forever.
So is that the real
I think
concern?
we need some way to prove where that is, right? It's definitely a spectrum, right?
Oh yeah, but to prove it, you have to implement it, right? You can't just do it in theory. Theory is great and everything, but
right, but you also can't just ape into it 100%, right? So we have to have some sort of process where we can measure, right, and we can say, okay, we are ready to decentralize this process because we know that it's going to work, right?
Yeah, I do think again, going back to my very first point, approving let's say 4 million for a specific quarter that then the current CEO and CTO, whatever, the current team can allocate however they see fit. So just not even specifically clarifying where these funds need to go to, and still having the ability for the current leadership team to allocate those funds as they see fit, but also having a maximum ceiling of what can actually be spent. I think that's, in my opinion, a pretty amicable compromise.
So would that say that, and hopefully I'm putting words in your mouth that make sense to me so I can comprehend it a little bit better. You would be in favor of seeing a compensation ceiling in terms of total spend for the period included as a part of this KIP extension?
Yes.
But you're also saying that it would still be at the full discretion of the CEO and CTO, but we could look at, say, the previous 2 quarters and extrapolate any necessary growth that might happen, and this is the number that we will not spend beyond.
Yeah, you can propose a number to the DAO, and then the DAO can vote on whether it believes that number is correct or not. So I would, we can okay, it's probably the other way around. We make a proposal with a certain number in mind, and then the DAO can vote on whether or not it believes that number is accurate.
But what do you think they would use as a basis to believe whether something is accurate?
I mean, the quarter 2 report, obviously.
But that's historical. I think that's based on
yeah,
past
and then we add.
Again, back to Hazard's point originally.
Input from the leadership at this point, but I would add maybe 20-30% maximum or less, depending on whatever belief that the current compensation levels are too high, which is again like we need some sort of ceiling or like yeah.
I'm not arguing about the ceiling. I just want to like understand like what we use as a basis, and I think this goes back to what Hazard was saying originally about developing KPIs and really systematically giving the DAO the tools they need to make an informed decision versus just kind of using a ceiling or a number as a gut check. Because I personally just knowing what I know about the Treasury. I want it to be systematic. I want people to have a clear understanding of what's going on before making decisions, and that's really hard in the space because not everybody are financial professionals or governance professionals or whatever it may be, or even payroll professionals. But we need to arm them with the information necessary, and I think that's what Hazard is saying. Over time, this isn't an argument towards decentralization. It's just about a cadence thing, really, and a sequence of events. And I think we're starting to get those fundamental building blocks to develop these systems using this type of information to allow the DAO to actually have the tools they need to make an informed decision.
Okay, just from my point of view, like it's been half a year, and at least in my opinion, there's been no real strive towards decentralization. And each previous proposal for KIP 12 and its subsequent renewal was for a quarter each, whereas the current one is for the rest of the year. It's like double as long as the current proposals. To me, that seems like not really a progress towards centralization. It's more like the opposite. Like we're extending the centralized how long we believe we need to actually implement those decentralized factions. Like we're not really seeing a continuous march towards it. Like we're seeing the opposite.
I would argue that our hires and the things that we're working towards are that march towards decentralization. This is more about ensuring that things have stability and get to continue moving forward and progressing while we make that march simultaneously.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, and I can't emphasize this enough, like Jason, and I know Hazard mentioned this, but Jason and Guard coming in are absolutely those moves towards decentralization, because not all of that can fall on Hazard or other people within the labs or even just the DAO. We really need the experts that can kind of see the whole landscape, both legal, governance, and really everything, and kind of package it up in meaningful ways like what we've seen Jason already start to do. So I would agree with Dietz. I would argue that those two hires alone, in addition to some other stuff, have been really, really fundamental building blocks that we need to do what we hope we can do from a decentralization standpoint.
Yeah, I don't want to hog too much time here, but just like again, is there like a specific reason why the current KIP 26 extension would be double as long as the previous extension? Is that just like to not vote again?
Well, I didn't write this proposal. It's important to know. But I would point out, just to add to some of the things before, that in terms of differences, that time factor is a difference. However, the other difference from the prior extension is that I think that this is the first one to really state in its own text that it should sort of complete this cycle of reorganization and work and be the last such renewal.
Yeah, I'm happy to piggyback on that. So as Hazard said, it was written in such a way that it was meant to be the last one, and also it added a lot of reporting and more transparency around how we're going to try to get to that point relative to the ones before it. And I know that this conversation has certainly been helpful in terms of thinking about how we can shape that communication better going forward.
So was there a specific, like I do believe you're the author of the KIP. Yeah. So was there a specific reason just to like make it till the end of the year instead of just a quarter as usual?
Yeah. So the idea was that we knew it was going to take more than a quarter to get some of these things done. I mean, just to take one example, just the legal structure alone is going to take a little while. And there are some other things we're working on around different things with the protocol and different things with products that are, a quarter seemed like we would just be back here having the same conversation and with an almost 100% certainty, whereas 2 quarters seem much more feasible.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that second remark.
Yeah. But we didn't want to make it less longer. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I don't want to hog the entire time, so I'll shut up for a second.
I think it's important to mention that, like, from our side, the contributors, it's not really a great situation to renew these powers every quarter, right? Because in a way, it's kind of like a stressful situation. Like, are people gonna, do they still have like confidence in us? Are they gonna try to sabotage it? Like, we want to move towards a more like longer term, like, I guess, predictable situation as well.
On the quarterly basis, I really want to stress on the increase in transparency and communications. The level of work and things that we want to continue to push forward throughout the next quarter, at least for Q3, and keeping up the level of reporting while also increasing kind of the daily exposure that folks have to all things that are happening here. I would like to say that, this extension doesn't really feel like it's getting its if we were to do this again at the end of Q3 after kind of doing another round of kind of end of quarter events and having a quarter's worth of transparency and things, but we weren't at a place where we're ready to completely end it. For me, that just doesn't seem like the right use of bandwidth, but that might just be my own personal opinion on that.
One comment I had wasn't really even about like this in particular. It's really just about time frame in the crypto world. I just think we kind of take for granted that like a quarter thing, so much happens. Like, I mean, I think we released Rook Protocol on April 22nd or something like that, and like that's less than 3 months ago. It's just really kind of crazy when you think about all that gets done, all the things that happen in the world, in the crypto world during this time. And so I think we take that for granted, and so like really a 6-month time frame to accomplish really kind of huge, kind of heavy tasks like what we're talking about. It really is a lot. I think it's an endeavor we try to squeeze in as much as possible in as short of time frame as possible. But in the end, when you look at traditional businesses or just how things move in just life in general, 6 months really isn't a ton of time. But I think it's always good to increase the cadence, right? I agree with you there, Priest.
All right, great. Well, is there? I want to keep the floor open. Is there anybody else who wants to chime in here?
So I wanted to acknowledge Priest's call out on concerns around a maximum budget for the officers of the current organization and a commitment to decentralization. And in how I understand Rook to work, I don't know why Priest couldn't just decide to, do his own kit with those suggestions to see how the organization actually responds in governance. I mean, I can see the value in them. I mean, it might be more headache than the labs people want, but so I'm new enough here. So there's a lot of the unspoken stuff. I just don't know, which makes me feel uncomfortable, but does give me fresh eyes. And so that's a curiosity that I've just had. They're good call outs, so you can propose them and see what happens.
Yeah, on that, like, just to be entirely clear, as I believe I've stated on previous calls and also with discussions with a lot of other community members, my main concern, as always, is still top end compensation, which I do believe is disproportionately high, especially under compensation 2.5 as it would have progressed. So I'm thankful for implementing that change. But we don't really know how compensation 3.0 will be structured. And I'm wary of leaving that structuring entirely up to the people that will eventually receive the salary. Especially if there's like there's been talks of raising the max UCC component, which I'm definitely not a fan of. And I don't want to have this sort of structure in place for when the eventual Comp 3.0 will be put in place. So if I were to make a KIP, like laying out max salaries for specific positions, would that even be I guess possible under the KIP structure? Like, can you specify salary caps for specific employees, specific positions in a DAO? under the current governance structure?
You can, but the way that it becomes difficult is that to pass, speaking generally, a proposal is going to need to gain consensus, right?
Yeah.
And that's, a process that can be difficult for proposals that are, that might, I don't think that let's say that let's take Guard's approach and assume that I'm either an idiot or evil. If I was evil, Dark Hazard, right? I would, cause a fuss. Let's say you want to cap my compensation. I would cause a fuss. And that lack of consensus would be, could spell some trouble, right? So ideally what we have is proposals that are sort of, driven by data and as objective as we can, anchored in things that we know. And it cuts both ways, obviously, because things that I may feel are not controversial, that's not really up to me, right? It could be very controversial for some folks, and consensus matters, and so on. So, yeah, it's.
I fully agree with there. I think pushing this through as a single KIP would grant it almost 100% likelihood of failure, not only because of internal consensus, but also because the SOFON structure, I believe, is still suboptimal as it currently stands, which is why I think something like this should be implemented in a more broad-based KIP, such as KIP 26. But I guess I can make an amendment to KIP 26, and it's really hard to implement that specifically. We would still have to go under the budget proposal, I think. But,
so this is where this it goes back to my thing about being able to live with certain areas of suboptimality versus exposing the larger amount of risk of the absolute downsides of situations where you just said yourself, if there was a budget KIP for salaries, you think there's zero chance of it passing. So that already would make me, as a DAO member, as a contributor, nervous that if there was not this extension and there's not the ability for us to even come to a consensus on contributors' budget, then that sounds like we are heading towards the end of the railroad tracks, and there's a cliff. And that situation is what I personally want to avoid at all costs.
I get where your concerns are coming from, but just to get back to Hazard's point, a KIP obviously needs to be driven about salaries, wouldn't need to be driven by data. But if compensation 3.0 will be passed, it won't necessarily have to be data supported. Having looked at various different DAO compensation levels, we're pretty much 1.5 to 2x above the top end compensation for pretty much every single other DAO I've looked at. And even the DAOs that were specifically mentioned when Comp 1.0 was passed have now adjusted salaries downwards. So I just don't see how, from as you mentioned, Hazard, data-driven approach, these top-end compensations can still be rationalized. The data-driven approach needs to obviously be coming if I do create a KIP, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in place because you do have unanimous powers to push something like that through without clarification or representation of other industry competitive salaries.
Well, that is and it isn't true. So let's take the example recently about the shift to 2.5, right? In which there were concerns raised by you and some others about the effect or how would it work with leadership salary, right? And the approach was changed, right? I and Joey did not opt to transition to 2.5, right? While allowing the contributors to do so, right? And the reason wasn't because we woke up that day and decided that we could pay our taxes better if this was the way that it was. The reason was because there were concerns raised that we didn't have the time or the space at that moment to fully explore and address and resolve in a satisfactory way, right? Because if we took that time, that would be time spent blocking contributors who are very important to the DAO from being able to run this transition. And so we opted out. But there was no vote and no KIP. What there was an endangerment of legitimacy, which could threaten the stability of the consensus that the DAO is under. And by doing that, could destabilize the workplace, the productivity, and then the products themselves, and ultimately the engine that drives the DAO's development, right? And there are these channels that are not explicit governance. They're voice, if you like. We talked about that when you were, voicing back then, that do have power, right? I mean, I am bound by a form of oversight that exists because of my continued self-interest and interest in the good of the DAO. It's not a perfect thing, and it's not something that can't ever change. Like Gard says, I could be an idiot and not know this, or I could be evil and not care about this. And that's something to be rightly worried about. But in terms of a temporary situation, it's been a reasonable amount of oversight and a reasonable amount of check on these things. But of course, we can't live in this honeymoon period for too long, right? That would not be wise either. So, but I agree with you about SOFONs and about these proposals and the difficulty and stuff. But I don't necessarily know that it would be true to say that there's no force pulling leadership to not justify any form of compensation, right? In a way that's satisfactory and can gain consensus, right?
All right. Well, I also wanted to point out that we're a couple of things. So compensation 3.0 is still very much in the works, and there's nothing that's been set in stone. And I know Tommy can speak to that if we have any more questions, maybe for another session. But I also wanted to note that we're at our hour, and so we can happily continue this conversation next week, or we can continue it as needed at the town hall on Friday. But in the meantime, wanted to thank everybody for coming, and thank Hazard and Priest in particular for this really great debate. And unless anybody has anything else they want to add, we had Wes had gathered some really interesting stuff in terms of current events that are in the agenda. So if you want to take a look at that just to see what's going on, one thing I would point out is our Treasury team put together a really interesting proposal at Optimism. So please take a look at that. The link to that is in the agenda. Unless anybody has anything else, I'm going to happily close the meeting and say thanks to everyone again.
Yeah, just like not specifically regarding this, but is there a timeline for an open discussion regarding Comp 3.0?
I will defer to Tommy on that, since he's the guy, the one who's leading that.
I'd say in a few weeks. 2-3 weeks, something like that.
Yeah. Remind me of the deadline for Comp 2.5 again. It's like 2 months, right? From when we passed it.
Yeah, we have about 6 weeks left.
September 23rd, roughly. Or, sorry, August 23rd, sorry.
Yeah, I would personally, I believe Comp 3.0 would probably be one of the more contentious topics. So if we could get discussion on that happening sooner rather than later, it would probably be more optimal, so as to not give these a heart attack.
Yeah, but I also need time to come up with something decent and go over it internally with other people from the working group. So I'm not really gonna rush this. So my aim is for in 2 weeks or so.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah.
if it can be sooner, that's great.
Yeah, and also
Because-
we're talking to external. Go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we're also talking to external parties about like different options as well. So we're just really trying to maximize what this end result looks like. So it's also on these other parties as well, not just internally.
All right. Well, thanks everybody again. We will see you all next week, and it sounds like we have a lot to keep discussing.
Thanks, Jace. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Priest, too, as well. It was great conversation.
Everyone.
All right.
Thank you all. Great meeting.